It was an early morning at Grayson's diner, just like any other. Inside, the hum of the kitchen echoed as chefs called out orders, the sizzle of eggs and bacon hitting the grill blending with the clinking of coffee mugs. The usual crowd, locals, travelers, and early risers, were already tucked into booths, enjoying their breakfasts without much thought about anything beyond their plates. But there was something different today. Outside, standing just beyond the doorway, a man lingered, looking in. His clothes were worn, faded from time, and his face, though slightly hidden beneath a frayed cap, held a quiet expression, as if he'd seen more than most people would ever care to know. The people inside barely glanced his way, casting quick looks before returning to their conversations. He was just another face on the street to them, a stranger not worth a second thought. The man's name was Michael. To most, he seemed like someone down on his luck, someone who might have ended up on the wrong side of life. But for those who took the time to look, there was something unusual in his eyes, a calmness, an intensity, like he knew more than he let on. Michael didn't seem rattled by the passing glances or dismissive looks. He just stood there, watching, as if he were waiting for something, or perhaps someone. Every now and then, his gaze drifted toward the door, as if silently considering whether to enter or turn back. The diner staff noticed him too, particularly Lisa, the manager. She was used to running things with an iron hand, priding herself on keeping the place orderly and professional. Her expression soured as she saw Michael standing by the entrance. To her, he was just another drifter, someone who'd probably come in hoping to sit for a while without ordering, taking up space she felt he didn't deserve. "Hey, we don't allow loitering," Lisa called out, her voice cutting through the chatter inside. Her tone was sharp, commanding, as if she'd said it 1,000 times before and didn't expect a reply. Michael looked at her, his expression neutral. There was no irritation, no anger. He simply met her gaze, nodded in acknowledgement, and took a small step back. But he didn't leave. He continued to stand just outside, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, glancing at the morning crowd through the window. To any passerby, he might have seemed aimless, but if one watched closely, they'd notice he wasn't just lingering, he was observing. Minutes passed, and the diner continued to hum with life. A few people who entered exchanged glances with Michael, curious but uninterested. For most, he was just a man outside the door, a face they'd forget within moments. But Michael remained there, patient, almost as if he were waiting for something specific. Lisa's irritation grew. She prided herself on keeping everything in order, and to her, this man's silent presence was an intrusion. She made her way to the entrance, signing with impatience. As she approached, Michael looked up, and there was a slight smile on his face. It wasn't smug or confrontational. It was as if he found something about the situation amusing, something Lisa clearly couldn't see. "Can I help you?" Lisa asked, crossing her arms. Her voice had softened, but her eyes held the same authority, the same impatience. "We're busy. Either come in and order, or move along, okay?" Michael didn't answer immediately. He gave a small nod, looking around at the other patrons through the windows, taking it all in. And then he finally spoke, his voice calm, almost too calm for someone in his position. "Busy morning," he said quietly, glancing around the diner. "Seems like you've got a good crowd today." Lisa's eyes narrowed. There was something strange about him, something she couldn't quite place, but she brushed it aside, convinced that he was just another man with nowhere else to go. She was about to turn back when he spoke again. "I'll be in soon," Michael added, his tone polite, almost respectful, yet with an underlying assurance that caught her off guard. Without waiting for her response, he stepped back, allowing her to return to her duties. Lisa watched him for a moment, puzzled, before shaking her head and heading back inside. To her, he was just a minor disturbance, someone who would soon leave, blending back into the streets like he'd never been there. But Michael wasn't in any hurry. He stood outside the diner, his gaze steady, as if he were studying the place, committing every detail to memory. And while the patrons and staff carried on, oblivious to the man by the door, Michael knew something they didn't. This diner wasn't just any place to him. It was one he'd known long ago, in a different time, a different life. And today, he was here for a reason that no one else yet knew. Little did anyone suspect that Michael wasn't there by chance. He hadn't stumbled upon this diner out of necessity or desperation. He had chosen to be here, to watch, to observe. And as he stood outside, he waited patiently, knowing that before the day was over, everything in this little corner of the world would change in ways they couldn't imagine. Michael finally stepped into the diner, moving with a quiet, unassuming presence. Heads turned briefly, then quickly shifted back to conversations and morning routines. To the customers, he was just a man who didn't quite belong, with his worn coat and aged cap. But Michael paid no mind to the glances. He moved calmly toward a corner booth, the one farthest from the windows, settling into the seat as if he were invisible. Lisa, the manager, didn't miss a beat. She noticed him immediately, her eyes narrowing with a familiar irritation. To her, Michael was exactly the type she was trained to spot. A man who might sit without ordering, linger without purpose. She had dealt with his kind before, and as far as she was concerned, he was just another distraction in her carefully managed day. Her heels clicked across the tile floor as she made her way over, her expression a mixture of annoyance and authority. "Excuse me," Lisa said, her tone clipped, as she approached Michael's booth. He looked up, meeting her eyes calmly, with no sign of protest. "I need you to order something if you're going to sit here. We don't allow people just hanging around." Michael nodded, as though he were accustomed to such treatment. There was no resistance in his expression, no anger, just a quiet acceptance. "Of course," he replied politely. "A coffee, please. Black." Lisa's eyebrows lifted, almost as if surprised he was willing to pay. "All right," she said, lingering for a moment before heading back toward the counter, casting a doubtful glance over her shoulder as she left. As far as she was concerned, he was only buying himself a few minutes in that booth. She didn't expect him to stay long. The other waitstaff passed by, casting quick glances his way but avoiding eye contact. The energy around Michael's booth was uneasy, like an unspoken discomfort had settled around him. But Michael simply sat in his quiet corner, watching, observing. His gaze moved across the diner, taking in every detail: the flickering light above the counter, the old jukebox by the entrance, the faded menu pinned to the wall. There was an air of familiarity in his eyes, as if he knew this place far better than anyone realized. When the coffee finally arrived, Lisa placed it in front of him with a slight thud, as if making a point. She didn't offer a smile or a word of welcome. Instead, she lingered, crossing her arms and looking down at him, as if waiting for him to do something wrong. Michael took a sip of the coffee, nodding his thanks, his expression as calm and steady as ever. But Lisa wasn't finished. She tapped her fingers on the table, a forced smile on her face that didn't reach her eyes. "I'll need you to pay up front," she said curtly, her tone indicating she expected resistance. "House policy." Michael didn't hesitate. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small folded bill, placing it on the table without a word. Lisa stared at him for a moment, almost disappointed that he didn't object. She snatched the bill and left without another word, glancing over her shoulder as if to remind him he was being watched. Minutes ticked by. Michael sat there, sipping his coffee slowly, unbothered by the hostile glances that occasionally came his way. But Lisa couldn't stand it. She made several trips past his booth, each time lingering just a second longer, her eyes narrowing as if she were trying to figure him out. Each time, Michael remained calm, a faint, almost imperceptible smile on his face, as though he knew something she didn't. Finally, after what felt like the 10th pass, Lisa couldn't hold back any longer. She stopped beside his booth, her voice dripping with impatience. "Look, I'm not trying to be rude," she began, in a tone that suggested the exact opposite. "But if you're not ordering anything else, I'll need you to finish up and give the booth to someone else. We don't exactly have room for people to just sit around." Michael met her gaze, his eyes steady, unwavering. He took another sip of his coffee, placing the cup down carefully. "I'm almost done," he replied, his tone polite. Yet there was a weight in his words that gave Lisa pause. But only for a moment. She let out a huff of annoyance. "All right," she said, turning on her heel. "Just don't take too long. We're running a business here." And with that, she walked away, the irritation visible in her stride. From his seat, Michael watched as Lisa moved back to the counter, whispering something to one of the younger waitstaff, who stole a glance at Michael and smirked. They didn't think he could see them, but Michael noticed every glance, every raised eyebrow, every subtle shake of the head. He didn't respond, but a quiet determination settled in his eyes. Then, as if on cue, a group of businessmen entered the diner, laughing loudly as they approached the counter. One of them looked over at Michael's booth, then back at Lisa, who was quick to seize the opportunity. "Gentlemen," Lisa greeted them, her tone suddenly warm and welcoming. "We've got a booth opening up soon, so just give me a moment, and we'll get you all settled in." The businessman nodded, eyeing Michael's booth. Lisa shot Michael a look, tapping her watch as if to remind him of her deadline. But Michael only nodded, taking his time with his last sip of coffee, savoring it in a way that seemed almost defiant. He placed the cup down gently, folded his hands on the table, and looked up at Lisa with a calm smile. "I'll be on my way in just a moment," he said, his voice even, yet there was a hint of something in his eyes, a quiet resilience, an inner strength that was impossible to ignore. Lisa faltered, caught off guard by the steadiness in his gaze. For a split second, it was as if she sensed there was more to him, something she hadn't accounted for. But the moment passed quickly, and her impatience took over once more. "Good," she said, barely hiding her irritation. "I'd hate to have to call someone over to make sure you leave." Her words were sharp, meant to remind him of his place. But Michael simply nodded, unfazed, as if he'd heard it all before. With one final glance around the diner, Michael stood, straightening his coat as he made his way to the door. The businessman took his booth almost immediately, their voices filling the space he left behind. But as Michael stepped out into the morning air, a small, knowing smile played at the corner of his mouth. The day was only beginning, and so was he. Michael lingered outside the diner after leaving his booth, glancing back through the window, watching as the lively crowd continued their morning routines, oblivious to the man who had just left. He observed the staff and patrons through the glass, his gaze thoughtful. There was something about the place that seemed familiar to him, a detail hidden beneath the surface that kept him from leaving entirely. Inside, the diner bustled with activity. The businessmen who'd taken Michael's booth were laughing, deep in conversation, oblivious to the irritation they'd caused only moments ago. At the counter, Lisa continued her rounds, serving customers with forced smiles and efficient, clipped movements. Occasionally, she would glance toward the door, her expression sharp, as if making sure Michael was truly gone. Michael leaned against the wall near the entrance, hands tucked into his coat pockets, taking in every detail of the place. The diner's name painted on the window, the framed photos hanging near the counter, the chipped tiles near the entrance that had likely been there for decades. He seemed to be counting every scratch, every dent, every faded spot. But despite his calm appearance, there was a quiet focus in his gaze, a sense that he was piecing together a puzzle only he could see. Inside, Lisa continued to work, a trace of annoyance still lingering in her movements as she served the guests who filled Michael's former booth. She muttered something under her breath as she grabbed a tray, casting a glance toward the door to confirm he was still outside, loitering near the entrance. One of the younger waitstaff noticed her look and approached her, lowering her voice to a whisper. "Do you think he's coming back?" the waitress asked, nodding slightly toward the window where Michael stood. "I thought he'd be gone by now." Lisa rolled her eyes, scoffing. I don't know, but if he thinks he can just hang around here, he's got another thing coming, she muttered, annoyance creeping into her tone. Honestly, these people, thinking they can just show up and take up space. If he doesn't move along soon, I'll have to make sure he knows he's not welcome. The waitress nodded, glancing back toward the door, her expression a mix of discomfort and curiosity. He doesn't look like he's leaving anytime soon. Lisa clenched her jaw, her impatience growing. Trust me, he'll get the message. Outside, Michael watched the interaction through the glass, catching the way Lisa and her staff talked about him with disdain, their dismissive glances betraying their frustration. He observed them without a hint of reaction, taking it all in quietly. It was as though he were watching a scene in a play, each gesture and expression adding another layer to the story he was piecing together. Finally, Lisa couldn't take it anymore. She wiped her hands on her apron and marched toward the door, her posture tense and her expression hard. She pushed the door open, stepping out to confront Michael directly. "Sir," she began, her voice tight with forced politeness, "is there something you need? I've been more than patient, but if you don't have a reason to be here, I'm going to have to ask you to move along. We can't have people just loitering outside our diner." Michael turned to face her, his expression as calm as ever. He didn't respond immediately, instead meeting her gaze with an unwavering steadiness that made her shift slightly. For a moment, it was as if he were studying her, sizing her up in a way that made her uncomfortable. But his voice, when he finally spoke, was calm and polite, almost disarmingly so. "Just taking in the view," he said, a faint smile on his lips. "I haven't been here in a long time. It's nostalgic." Lisa raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "Well, maybe you should take that nostalgia elsewhere. We have a business to run here, and I can't have you standing around making the customers uncomfortable." Michael nodded, acknowledging her words without a trace of resentment. "I understand," he replied simply, glancing once more through the window, his gaze lingering on the photos behind the counter. "Good," Lisa replied, her tone softening slightly, though the impatience in her eyes remained. "It's nothing personal, all right. We just can't have people hanging around for no reason." Michael nodded again, his expression unreadable. "Nothing personal," he echoed, his voice carrying a hint of something. A quiet understanding, a calm acceptance that Lisa couldn't quite place. As she turned to go back inside, Michael's gaze followed her, and for a brief moment, something flickered in his eyes, a glimmer of recognition as his gaze landed on one of the photos behind the counter. It was a small, faded picture tucked behind the register, almost hidden among the other frames, as if it were forgotten or overlooked. Michael's face softened as he looked at the photo, his expression growing distant, thoughtful. The picture was old, its colors faded with time, showing a younger version of a man standing in front of the diner. The man in the photo wore the same calm expression Michael wore now, his eyes bright with a quiet confidence that matched Michael's own. He took a slow breath, looking at the picture for a long moment, a trace of a smile flickering on his lips. But he said nothing, simply nodding to himself as if confirming a memory, a thought he alone understood. Lisa, meanwhile, had returned to the counter, busying herself with refilling coffee mugs and preparing orders. She was still muttering under her breath about the stranger outside and how she'd had enough of people thinking they could just take advantage. Her words were sharp, dismissive, but Michael didn't react. He simply stood by the window, his gaze fixed on the photo, his expression calm, patient. As he continued to observe, Michael noticed the small details that others overlooked, the tired expressions on the staff's faces, the subtle tensions between the employees, the quiet way some of them spoke to each other when Lisa wasn't looking. It was clear that the place wasn't running as smoothly as it appeared, and while Lisa barked orders with authority, there was a strain beneath the surface, a sense that things weren't quite as they seemed. Michael remained outside, quietly watching, piecing together fragments of the story that the diner held. He was unnoticed by most of the customers, yet his presence had a quiet weight, as if he were part of the place itself, a silent observer with a deeper understanding of the world inside. Finally, after a long while, he turned to leave, casting one last look at the diner, the worn sign above the door, and the faded photo behind the counter. He walked away, his figure blending into the morning crowd, leaving behind a sense of mystery, a lingering presence that seemed to stay with the diner long after he'd gone. Back inside, Lisa went about her day, unaware of the quiet revelation that had just taken place, of the man who had observed more than she realized, who had come and gone like a shadow. But for Michael, the visit had been more than just a nostalgic walk down memory lane. It had been a chance to confirm something he'd long suspected, a chance to see the place that held memories and stories he alone understood. The morning continued, the diner returned to its usual rhythm, but an air of suspense lingered, a quiet anticipation that only Michael truly understood. And as he walked away, a faint smile played at the corner of his mouth. Today was only the beginning. The next morning, Lisa arrived at the diner just before dawn, keys jangling in her hand as she unlocked the door. She was tired, grumbling under her breath about the long hours and endless demands. But as manager, she took pride in running the place efficiently. She had no time for nonsense or anyone who, in her eyes, wasted space or resources. The memory of Michael lingering around the diner yesterday still irritated her. In her mind, he was just another nobody who didn't belong. As the morning rush began, the diner filled with regulars, business people, and the occasional passerby looking for a quick bite. Lisa moved about the diner, her usual brusque demeanor evident, as she directed her team with sharp gestures and hurried commands. But just as she was setting down an order, the sound of the door opening caught her attention. She looked up, expecting to see a new customer. Instead, there stood Michael, dressed sharply in a tailored suit, his shoulders held high and an unmistakable air of authority about him. He was no longer the unassuming figure in a worn coat and cap, blending into the background. Today, he commanded attention. For a moment, Lisa was speechless. She blinked, trying to reconcile the man in front of her with the figure she had dismissed so easily the day before. But there was no mistaking it. This was Michael, and he looked entirely different, exuding confidence and presence. The usual lines of weariness were softened by an expression of calm purpose, and his eyes held the same quiet intensity she had noticed before, only now it was sharper, focused directly on her. "Good morning," Michael said, his voice calm but carrying a weight that made several patrons turn to look at him. "I'd like to have a word with you, if you don't mind." Lisa's surprise quickly turned into irritation. She wasn't in the mood to deal with whatever this was, some scheme or attempt to disrupt her day. She glanced around, seeing the other customers watching, and forced a tight smile, trying to keep her voice even. "I don't know what this is about, but we're quite busy," she said curtly. "If you're here to make a scene, I'll have to ask you to leave." Michael smiled, undeterred. "I assure you, I'm not here to cause any trouble. I just think it's time for some introductions." He paused, letting the silence settle before he spoke again. "My name is Michael Grant. I'm the new owner of this establishment." The words landed like a thunderclap, the shock rippling through the diner as customers and staff alike turned to stare. Lisa's mouth fell open, her face blanching as she processed what he'd just said. You're the new owner," she stammered, disbelief mingling with a creeping sense of dread. Michael nodded, his expression calm yet firm. "Yes, I recently acquired this diner along with several others in the area. Yesterday, I came in to observe, to understand the environment, the staff, and the way things are managed here. I wanted to see the diner through an ordinary visitor's eyes." Lisa's mind reeled. She remembered all the dismissive comments she'd made, the irritated glances, the impatience with which she treated him. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. She had treated the new owner as if he were a nuisance, someone unworthy of her respect. Her cheeks flushed with embarrassment, and for a moment, she was at a loss for words. I had no idea," she finally managed, her voice faltering. If I'd known. Michael held up a hand, cutting her off. If you had known, would you have treated me differently? He asked, his gaze piercing. I came here as an unknown, someone you thought was beneath your notice. I wanted to see how you treated people who don't fit your idea of a valuable customer. And what I saw yesterday was eye-opening. Lisa opened her mouth to protest, but the words died in her throat. She looked around, feeling the weight of the other patrons' eyes on her, the silence growing heavier with each passing second. Michael continued, his voice steady but resolute. In this diner, I saw people who work hard, who give their time and energy day in and day out. But I also saw a pattern, how you reserve respect only for those you consider worthy, and those who don't meet your standards. He shook his head. They're dismissed, overlooked, and spoken to as if they're less than. Lisa's face flushed deeper, her composure slipping. She stammered, trying to find an excuse, anything to explain her behavior. I was just doing my job. I have to keep things in order. And sometimes people they don't follow the rules. I didn't mean any harm. Michael's expression remained calm, but there was no softness in his gaze. This diner isn't just a business, he said, his voice carrying a quiet conviction. It's a place where everyone should feel welcome, regardless of their background or appearance. I understand the need for order, but respect is non-negotiable. Every customer, every person deserves that. The weight of his words settled over the room, and for a moment, there was only silence. Lisa looked down, the reality of her actions sinking in. She had treated him as an outsider, assuming he had no importance, no place in her carefully controlled world. And now he was the one in control, standing before her not as an annoyance, but as the man who held her future in his hands. Taking a deep breath, Michael turned his gaze to the rest of the staff, who stood watching, a mixture of surprise and uncertainty in their faces. As the new owner, I plan to make some changes, he announced, his tone firm. Changes that will ensure every person who walks through these doors is treated with dignity and respect. This diner has a reputation, and it's time we live up to it in every way. The staff exchanged glances, a new energy sparking among them. For some, it was a moment of vindication, a long-awaited shift they had quietly hoped for. For others, it was a revelation, a glimpse of the values Michael held, values that now, as their boss, he intended to instill. Lisa swallowed, her earlier bravado entirely gone. She looked at Michael, trying to salvage some part of the situation, to find a way to redeem herself. Mr. Grant. Michael, she said, her voice softer, almost pleading. I understand now, and I promise I'll do better. I just didn't realize. Michael gave a small nod, his expression softening slightly. Lisa, this isn't about punishment. It's about making things right. If you're willing to embrace the changes we need here, you'll have my support. But things can't continue as they have been. Lisa nodded quickly, relief mingling with her lingering embarrassment. Yes, absolutely. I understand. I'll work on it. Michael took one last look around the diner, the familiar faces, the old photos on the wall, the tables and booths that held countless stories. He'd come back here to make a difference, to honor the place that had once meant so much to him, and to ensure it would become a place where respect was given to everyone who walked through the doors. And now, with a sense of purpose and resolution, he turned back to the staff, nodding his approval. Good, he said, his voice steady and calm. Then let's get to work. The silence lifted, and the diner slowly came back to life, patrons and staff alike buzzing with the news. Michael's presence lingered as he walked out, leaving behind a transformed atmosphere, a sense of justice served and new beginnings dawning. And though he left quietly, the impact of his words remained, a lasting reminder of the power of respect and the importance of seeing beyond appearances. In the weeks that followed Michael's revelation, Grayson's Diner experienced a transformation that could be felt by everyone who walked through its doors. Under Michael's leadership, the diner took on a fresh energy, an atmosphere that welcomed every customer with warmth and respect. The staff worked with a renewed sense of purpose, knowing that their efforts were recognized and that they were part of something bigger than just serving food. The changes Michael had promised were in motion, and they extended beyond simple policy shifts. They reached into the core of how the diner operated, creating an environment where everyone felt valued. For Lisa, the transition was less comfortable. The realization of how she had treated Michael, and likely others over the years, left her with a lingering sense of embarrassment and regret. Michael hadn't fired her. Instead, he offered her a choice: embrace the changes he intended to make or step aside for someone who would. Lisa decided to stay, determined to prove that she could adapt, though the process challenged her in unexpected ways. Under Michael's guidance, she was held accountable for her actions, something she hadn't experienced before. Michael didn't criticize her openly, nor did he humiliate her. Instead, he made it clear that respect was to be given to every individual, regardless of their background. He led by example, treating each member of the staff with the same kindness and dignity he had extended to her, showing Lisa the value of a leadership style she had never considered. Lisa had to relearn her approach to management, starting with simple gestures, like greeting each customer warmly, taking a moment to acknowledge the efforts of her team, and embracing the diversity of the people who walked through the diner's doors each day. Gradually, she became more attuned to the needs of the staff and the patrons, learning to build connections rather than simply enforcing rules. For the first time, she began to understand that her role as a manager wasn't about wielding authority, but about fostering respect and unity. The other employees noticed the shift in Lisa's attitude. While some were initially skeptical, they saw her genuinely trying to change. She asked for input from the team, took on feedback with humility, and worked to improve the culture she had once unknowingly stifled. In time, Lisa earned back the respect of her coworkers and the customers, but this time it was based on mutual understanding rather than fear or control. Michael's presence was a constant source of quiet inspiration. Though he didn't spend every day at the diner, his impact was unmistakable. Whenever he visited, he took the time to speak with each staff member, asking them about their lives, their aspirations, and their thoughts on the diner's progress. He encouraged them to share their ideas, empowering them to take ownership of their roles. His genuine interest in their well-being created a ripple effect, fostering a sense of camaraderie that had been missing before. Under Michael's leadership, Grayson's Diner became known as more than just a place to grab a meal. Word spread about the diner where everyone was welcome, where respect was a core value, and where the staff treated every customer with the same kindness and warmth. Customers who had once felt overlooked now found themselves greeted with a smile, and those who returned felt a sense of belonging. The diner's reputation flourished, drawing in a loyal customer base that appreciated the newfound spirit of inclusivity. As for Michael, he had achieved what he'd set out to do. The diner that held memories of his past was now a place of renewal, a tribute to the values he believed in. He hadn't come back just to claim ownership. He had returned to bring about meaningful change. His quiet strength and fair-minded approach left a lasting mark, both on the diner and on those who worked there. In the end, he had not only reclaimed a piece of his history, but had also given the diner a future grounded in respect and dignity. Justice had been served, not through retribution but through transformation. Michael had shown that real power lay in leading by example, in lifting others up rather than tearing them down. And for those who had once underestimated him, he had become a living reminder that true character is not measured by appearances, but by actions. As the dust settled at Grayson's Diner, a new chapter began, one defined by respect, integrity, and the quiet power of second chances. Michael's journey had transformed more than just a small business. It had become a testament to the idea that genuine change is possible when people are willing to look beyond the surface. Through his actions, he had shown everyone, from his employees to the customers. That value isn't tied to appearances, titles, or first impressions. It's rooted in character, compassion, and a willingness to see the potential in others. Lisa's transformation became a symbol of that very principle. She, who had once measured people by their looks, learned the true weight of her role as a leader. Her evolution reminded everyone watching that it's never too late to grow, to adjust one's perspective, and to embrace the strength and humility. She went from being the gatekeeper of narrow standards to becoming an ally, someone who uplifted others and fostered an atmosphere of kindness. In doing so, Lisa reclaimed a dignity she hadn't realized she'd been missing, one that stemmed from self-awareness and respect for others. The diner, now thriving under Michael's guidance, held a deeper meaning for everyone involved. It was more than a workplace, more than a simple establishment. It had become a gathering place for people of all backgrounds, a safe harbor where kindness reigned and every visitor could expect to be treated with dignity. Michael's quiet influence touched each person who passed through those doors, leaving an indelible mark that would long outlast him. And so, the story of Grayson's Diner became a story shared far beyond its walls. Patrons who had witnessed the changes told their friends, spreading word of the diner with the unseen owner who treated everyone equally, who had stepped in not to flaunt power, but to reshape a culture. Soon, the diner wasn't just popular. It was respected, known for its warmth and inclusivity. It became a place where strangers could feel like friends, where anyone, from regulars to those just passing through, felt like they belonged. In the end, Michael's legacy was a simple but profound reminder. True strength lies in actions, not in appearances. It's in the choices we make when no one's looking, the patience we extend to others, and the respect we afford those who may not have earned it yet. Because real character isn't about commanding respect. It's about inspiring it. As the story closes, one truth resonates, a lesson Michael embodied and left behind for all who crossed his path. That sometimes the person you least expect is the one with the greatest capacity to change everything. It's easy to judge, to assume, to see only what's on the surface. But those willing to look closer, to hold back judgment, often discover that people are far more than what meets the eye. Michael's story is a testament to that power, to the belief that real change begins when we start seeing each other with compassion, understanding, and respect. And so, as Michael looked back on his journey with quiet satisfaction, he left viewers with a final thought. Never underestimate the quiet ones, the overlooked or the dismissed. They may be the ones carrying wisdom, strength, and the power to make the world a better place, one small act of respect at a time.